Sanho Tree, who is here to my right, is a person I've known for a long time. And when I think about why I enjoy working with IPS, it's because of people like Sanho. I place him at the top of the list in terms of people that I've learned from, people I admire, a person that I feel it's amazing that I'm able to get him in this room because he's always traveling, either to Colombia or somewhere. But here's an individual I think that you'll learn a lot about and from. His lecture topic today is Addicted to Failure, Why the Drug War Has Failed and Prospects for Reform. And here's Sanho Tree.
It's an honor to be here. And I've been working on the war on drugs for the past decade or so, looking at both the supply side and the demand side, and looking at strategies the government has been using and why things haven't worked. Drugs have been winning. Well, part of the problem is that we declare war on things that can't surrender, and the drugs aren't surrendering. Neither are the plants they come from. But I want to talk about the parameters of the problem and look at some of the political solutions that have been tried and why they've been tried and why they've failed and some possible ways out of this problem. But whenever I talk about the international drug economy, there are three factors I'd like you to keep in mind. And these are the three things that our government has never been able to really seriously address or solve. And these are the three things that continue to boomerang and impact the drug war. The first factor to keep in mind is extreme poverty. According to the UN Development Program and to the World Bank, they estimate that about 1.2 billion people on this planet survive on less than $1 a day. Right? So if this were $1 in a soda machine, that's all the money I would have for the day to pay for food, housing, healthcare, education, transportation, fertilizer, medical care, all of that on $1 a day. Roughly half the planet lives on less than $2 a day. So we're talking about a lot of people who don't have a lot of economic alternatives, and they happen to live in places in the world where there's not a lot of state presence. That is to say that there aren't police on every street corner telling you can't grow a certain crop. And so, of course, a lot of people grow these illicit crops because it pays so much better than growing legal crops. The second factor to keep in mind, in addition to poverty, is high demand, undiminished demand in countries like the United States, Canada, Western Europe, but increasingly societies like Brazil, Eastern Europe, the drug economy is expanding quite rapidly. And the fact is we don't have sufficient demand reduction in this country, that we have a failed educational system when it comes to educating kids about drug prevention. The DARE program, have people been through the DARE program? Any great success stories? It's been a deeply flawed program historically, and even DARE has admitted itself that it's got some real serious problems. But also, we don't provide treatment on request for addicts who want it. People who say, I've had enough, I really need some help to get off these drugs, but unless you have private health insurance, if you show up at a public treatment center, good luck. It'll take you perhaps months before a slot opens up at a treatment facility if you can't pay for it. And if you've given up if you lose that opportunity to treat someone when they're asking for help, when they want to give up, you've probably lost that opportunity. They've gone back to using. They're by definition addicted. They needed some help in order to stop, and we're turning people away. This makes no sense to me, especially since this is a demand-driven problem, not a supply-driven problem. If I were to testify in front of Congress, say if you have a dozen members of Congress up in the dais, and I laid out a dozen syringes filled with heroin, and I would ask how many of you would inject? Probably 0. And the question is why? They have lives worth looking forward to. They have something that's going to get them through the day. And when you deal with communities that don't have hope, that don't think that tomorrow is going to be a better day, then you've got a different set of issues to deal with, both in terms of drugs and other societal issues as well. But our politicians don't ask these questions. Instead, the thrust of the drug war has been to keep the drugs out of the hands of people, as though somehow supply determines usage, or availability does. And so, and it's also, the RAND Corporation, a fairly conservative think tank, was commissioned by the U.S. Army and by the Drug Czar's office to do a study called Controlling Cocaine. They looked at the problem of how do you reduce cocaine consumption in the United States, for instance, by just 1%. Right? These are realists. And they found that when they looked at different policy options, dollar for dollar, it was, to get that 1% reduction, about 23 times more cost-effective to fund treatment for addicts in the United States than it was to try to chase drugs around at the source in places like Colombia or Bolivia or Afghanistan. So dollar for dollar, we're following the least cost-effective means of reducing drug use in the United States, if indeed that's what this whole international drug war is about. The third factor, in addition to poverty and high demand, is what I call the artificial escalation of the value of what are essentially worthless weeds and shrubs and flowers. Things like marijuana, coca bushes where we get cocaine from, the opium poppy where we get heroin and morphine from. These are plants that have no magical properties. They're very simple to grow. They're easy to grow. They've grown wild for millions of years. Marijuana and poppy will grow in all 50 of the United States. Coca will grow in just about any climate that doesn't freeze. And it's our policies and only our policies that make these plants so incredibly valuable. What I mean by that is that if you took the 10-year price average of an ounce of gold, omit the last 2 years where the economy's gone down the toilet and gold has skyrocketed, but traditionally the gold prices have fluctuated between $300 to $400 an ounce. That's roughly the amount of money you would spend on the streets of Washington, D.C. for an ounce of marijuana. Okay, an ounce of marijuana, an ounce of gold. Should they be the same? This in value. What kind of a system do we have where we create a system where someone can actually put a seed into the ground and literally mint their own gold? To me, that's insane. We call this stuff weed for a reason. It grows like a weed. It's not difficult to produce. But because we keep escalating law enforcement, because there's so much risk involved in the drug economy, there's a risk-reward, an incentive for people to traffic in these drugs. The higher the likelihood you might get apprehended by law enforcement, the longer the potential prison sentence you might have to serve, the more dangerous the environment you're operating in, the higher the premium you're allowed to charge the next person down the line, right? So let me give you an example of how this works in the real world. You can buy a kilo of pure cocaine on the streets of Medellin, Colombia for about $1,500, give or take. It fluctuates from time to time, but roughly $1,500, let's say. By the time you got to the streets of Washington, D.C. or Baltimore or New York, and the dealers cut it up into little gram bags and dilute it with whatever garbage they cut the stuff with, you can get approximately $100,000 to $150,000 for that exact same kilogram. Okay. What the user is ultimately paying for then are transportation costs, or rather the risks associated with transportation. Right? We keep escalating the drug war. It makes the drugs more valuable. We keep trying to constrict the supply of drugs while the demand remains constant, thereby driving up prices and profits. So that's part of the catch-22 of the drug war. And if you don't deal with any of these three factors, these three things come together and create a perfect storm of forces that are just about impossible to stop. When I was sketching notes for this lecture, I thought I would call this the Trinity lecture because I'm going to give you examples in threes for some reason today. There are also three types of problems that we encounter in this world. There are types of problems that have simple solutions, that are knee-jerk solutions, the obvious answers, right? And then there are the kinds of problems that don't have any answers. And then there are kinds of problems that have counterintuitive answers. It's very important, the last option, because some of the toughest societal problems we have today are problems that have counterintuitive solutions. People know what I mean by counterintuitive? I'll give you an example. This is counterintuitive. These are Chinese finger cuffs or Mexican finger cuffs, whatever you call them. The harder you pull, the stucker you get, right? And it's counterintuitive to think, well, maybe the way to get out of this is to not pull so hard, but to relax a little bit and free yourself that way. So if at first you don't succeed, if the first 100 times you don't succeed, maybe you've got one of those problems that has a counterintuitive solution. The war on terror, the war on gangs, the war on drugs, all these kinds of problems have very, very often counterintuitive solutions. That is to say that being tough is the opposite of being effective. And this is where we get into these political problems. When our legislators see this kind of illegal behavior, whether you're using illegal drugs or growing them or trafficking in them or money laundering, you're breaking the law. What are they going to do? They're lawmakers. They have to make sure that laws are enforced. I don't necessarily agree with the laws, but I agree with the idea that you have to have a consistent system of laws. And so naturally their first reaction is to escalate law enforcement. That's the knee-jerk reaction, the intuitive solution. Throw some more policing or more militarized solutions. That'll solve the problem. Coercion. Well, there are limits to what you can achieve through coercion. And very often when you're dealing with drug prohibition, the intuitive response backfires in some pretty profound ways. One of those most important ways is that it causes the drug economy to evolve. And it evolves under Darwinian principles, right? Selection of the fittest. When we keep escalating law enforcement decade after decade at this problem, the kinds of people we typically capture are the kinds of people who are dumb enough to get caught. I mean, no offense if anyone's ever been busted for anything, but the slang on the street is that the dealer who uses loses. You'll get careless, you'll get sloppy, you'll eventually get apprehended. The same thing happens on the international level. It's basically the people who screw up that we end up catching because they've made a mistake. And conversely, the kinds of people we typically miss when we keep escalating law enforcement are the people who are the most innovative, the most adaptive, the most resourceful, the most cunning. We cause this economy to evolve at a lightning pace, much faster than it would otherwise. I mean, if only we could adapt this kind of thing, framework for green energy or something, we'd have solved this energy crisis by now. But the drug prohibition is a tremendous engine for creating innovation. There are dozens and dozens of submarines that have been captured now from Colombia coming to the United States or coming up to Mexico. The traffickers are building submarines. Some of them are semi-submersibles. They're kind of a fiberglass thing that's mostly underwater and they're towed or whatever. Some of them are really sophisticated submarines built with Russian engineers and stuff. And, I mean, they caught one in 2000 in Bogota, Colombia. Now, Bogota, Colombia is in the Andes. It's 8,000 feet high in the Andes, right? What kind of chutzpah, what kind of nerve does it take to build a submarine in Bogota and think you're going to get it down to the ocean without detection? And this is not the first one they caught, right? So there's tremendous innovation going on in this economy. And when we keep throwing law enfortement as a problem, we're basically thinning out the herd, right? We can't hope to win our war on drugs when our policies see to it that only the most efficient operations survive. And not only do they survive, but they thrive because, again, we've done two things unintentionally to help them. Number one, we've eliminated the competition for them. We've picked off the inefficient traffickers, the clumsy ones. And number two, we've tried to constrict the supply of drugs available on the street while the demand remains the same, thereby driving up their prices and their profits, right? So we've done them a tremendous favor in this regard. Well, so some people say, well, you shouldn't go after then the little fish because you'll end up breeding super traffickers, right? Kind of like how public health professionals say you shouldn't use these antibacterial soaps and cleansers and pop antibiotics every time you have a sore throat because it kills off very often the weak bacteria, and the drug-resistant strains are then able to take over in that space and multiply. Right, which is why if you use antibacterial kitchen soap, you'll end up with some of the most dangerous kitchen sink bacteria in the country. And that's somewhat analogous to what we've been doing with the drug war. So some people say, don't do that. Don't go after little fish because you'll breed super traffickers. Go after instead the big cartels, the big traffickers, whether it's at the municipal level or the international level. Well, we've been doing that for decades as well. And it's, again, had a number of unintended consequences. You probably have heard of the Medellin cartel, the Cali cartel, back in the 1990s. These were the two dreaded gigantic cocaine cartels that ruled the cocaine economy. Right? The United States worked with Colombian law enforcement to break up those cartels. A lot of courageous people in law enforcement died in the process. But they finally did it. They broke up the cartels. And you think, well, that should have put that should have solved the problem. It should have put at least a big dent in this problem, right? More drugs than ever are coming out of Colombia. So what happened? Well, for me, this is a really good illustration of the kind of hubris we face in Washington, particularly on Capitol Hill. Congress likes to talk about democratizing things. We're going to democratize Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, Iraq, whether they want it or not. But I would argue that the only thing that we have effectively democratized in Latin America through the use of military force is the drug economy itself. That is to say, we knocked out the two big monopolies. And we opened up this incredibly lucrative drug trafficking space to all the smaller cartels that have since taken over in the wake of the two big cartels. And at this point, we can't even estimate the number of smaller operations that have taken over in this space, much less try to infiltrate and disrupt them. These are very often referred to as boutique cartels, micro cartels. Very often they're family run, vertically integrated. They each have their own list of officials they bribe, their own smuggling routes. And so we've democratized this problem now. So in some ways, we've made this much worse. Well, that's because neither approach has worked, because neither approach takes into consideration why it is people continue to traffic in these drugs over and over again, year after year. And that has very little to do with narco-terrorism, which is the buzzword you heard throughout the past 8 years in terms of the debates in Congress, and everything to do with the fact that prohibition economics makes these minimally processed agricultural commodities extremely valuable. That's why people do it. We've also applied a war paradigm to this problem. That is to say, a war on drugs. That's how politicians show they're being serious. They're going to, war on cancer, war on gangs, war on terror. Well, I used to work as a diplomatic and military historian, studying how countries get into wars and especially how you get out of wars. And one thing I learned is that wars are about employing brute force, right, coercion, to extract a political concession or a capitulation from a rational state actor. That is to say, country A uses its military against country B to get it to surrender or bend to its will. And instead, we applied this paradigm to plants. Right? The coca seed does not sit in the ground and think to itself, well, should I stay dormant for 6 more months? Will I get a better price in the market then? What's the latest threat coming from the U.S. Congress? Are they going to hit me with one of these spray planes? In Plant Colombia, we're trying to defoliate Colombia, trying to wipe these drug crops out. It hasn't worked, by the way. Plants are not rational actors. They don't obey the laws of Congress. They obey the laws of nature and the laws of the market. And because so many individuals around the world have attached themselves to this drug economy, driven either out of poverty and desperation, or perhaps to feed their own addiction, or out of greed, or to fund an insurgency, but for whatever reason, all of these individuals who are involved in the drug economy do so because they think they'll get away with it. And by and large, they do at the global level. Most people are never caught. And so when we talk about waging a war against all these individual actors, you will never get a coherent surrender from all these people, whether it's the coca farmer in southern Colombia, the poppy farmer in Afghanistan, the lawyer on Case Street snorting cocaine, the kid in the high school bathroom dealing marijuana. There is no international high command of the drug economy that says, okay, everyone, we're licked finally, let's just give up. Grower stop growing, user stop using, you stop trafficking. That will never happen. So the point of this is that we've been waging a war for decades against an enemy who is quite literally incapable of surrendering. This is by definition a forever war, right? A quagmire, if you will. Just as an aside, back in 2000, I was talking to a young congressional staffer about lack of end game, how there's no stopping point in this, and I said, it's quagmire, and at the end he says, well, you've used this word over and over again, quagmire. What does that mean exactly? After Iraq, everyone knows what quagmire means now. There is no logical stopping point. There is no point at which we say we finally win. We get to come home and bring our troops home and get our medals and parades and go on with our careers. So there's no logical stopping point. So be careful when politicians tell you they want to declare war against something, particularly against social problems that can't surrender. Now, why does this continue in Congress? In my opinion, there are 3 main reasons legislators keep approving more drug war measures. They happen to be cowardice, ignorance, and opportunism. Ignorance, I mean, yes, some members of Congress are still ignorant about the drug war, and they thought very little about it, and they take the very intuitive knee-jerk solution. Drugs are bad. Of course we want to have a war on drugs. Why wouldn't we if they're bad? There are fewer and fewer of those people. After so many decades now, members of Congress, it's a bit cynical to think that they really don't get it. They don't think that the alternatives might work better than the current model. So there are some ignorant members of Congress left, but they're dwindling in number. I think the majority fall under the category of opportunism. That is to say that, cowardice, rather. The majority fall under the category of cowardice. That is to say they know better, but they're afraid to vote against it. They're afraid of getting smeared at election time. They're being swift-voted by their political opponents. Right? And so they largely go with the flow. No one ever lost their seat for voting for the drug war or got attacked for voting for the drug war. And until that changes, it's easier for elected officials to support these measures. And then there's a small minority that are the opportunists in the drug war, primarily Republican, but some Democrats as well, who think they're going to make their career off of this. This is how they're going to be able to convince their constituency that I'm tougher than the next person. You should keep sending me back to Washington. I will deal with this problem. But how do we get out of this problem? And I'm publishing a chapter that's being released in a book. It was released this week, actually, called Mandate for Change. There are copies in the back table there, and it outlines what I'm about to tell you. And I'll give this explanation in 3 quotes. First quote I want to use is from one of my favorite popular philosophers. You've probably have heard of him. Last name is Simpson, first name Bartholomew. All right, I think the great lessons of life can all be learned through The Simpsons. Bart Simpson captured it perfectly in one of the episodes where he runs for class president, right? And he begins his campaign by attacking his opponent. And he says, "My opponent says there are no easy answers. Well, I say he's not looking hard enough." That's essentially the problem with Congress. They want the easy solutions. They think that the electorate can only understand easy solutions. And the longer counterintuitive ones, think how long I've taken to explain to you the parameters of this problem, are not conducive to sound bites on the 6 o'clock news. And what they're afraid of is that they're afraid of, in particular, the 15, 30-second smear ads that come on during election time. Having just gone through an election cycle, you probably remember a lot of them. But imagine something that goes like this. Let's say I want to challenge Congressman Miller here for his seat. He's a flaming liberal, and he voted against Plan Colombia and the drug war down there. Well, come on, it's, how evil can you be? I will run an ad that goes something like this. Friends, Congressman Miller doesn't care if your kids are to do the drugs. He knows where the drugs are coming from. They're coming from Colombia. The Colombian government asked him, begged him to help fight this war on drugs. He refused to supply this aid. Come on, folks. Send me to Washington. I'll approve this money. We'll go down there and clean up this mess, and I will protect your kids. Now, Congressman Miller, if he's lucky, is going to have maybe 60 seconds on a 6 o'clock news and hope that all the people who saw my smear ad, which is very cheap to run, air over and over and over again, and hope that all the people who saw my smear are going to tune in at 6 o'clock to hear him give a soundbite response to this. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. And most members of Congress, their staffs are very busy. They're voting on every issue under the sun, and they devote about this much mental space per year to these issues. And so unless you are well versed in this subject, it's very difficult to communicate a paradigm shift in a soundbite. To me, that's the definition of power in Washington, right? If you can communicate a paradigm shift in a soundbite, you've got some traction. You've got some chance of getting your message across on a 6 o'clock news, and your voters might actually remember that. What do I mean by that? Well, I come from a region in China where Confucius came from. And back in the day, when you had a largely pre-literate society, the way you passed down wisdom from one generation to the next was through the oral tradition, as many traditional cultures around the world. And Confucius did this through proverbs, which are essentially teaching sound bites. They're things that you could remember that might rhyme a little bit or might tell a story, but you could remember them easily and pass that on to the next generation. Right? So there are 2 kinds of sound bites. There's that kind of teaching sound bite, and there's a stupid, cheesy sound bite like Axis of Evil. I mean, what does that teach you about anything? Nothing. It's just, it doesn't even rhyme, right? But on the other hand, if Congressman Miller here were able to say on the 6 o'clock news, look, sending guns and helicopters to the Andean region isn't going to solve the problem of poverty down there, and it's not going to solve the problem of addiction here in the States. And we're at a junction where we can either throw more police, hire more prosecutors, build more prisons to deal with this problem, or, which is about as effective as digging more graves to solve the international AIDS crisis, or we can finally start reinvesting in our society, giving people a reason to look forward to tomorrow. And those are the choices in front of us. You might get some traction with that, right? And so that's one of the main challenges with elected officials. They don't know how to message these kinds of issues. Now, the second quote I want to give you is from the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, who's still Prime Minister. He said this a couple of years ago about a different issue, about trade, which is a controversial issue at the time in Luxembourg, a very tiny country in Europe. But there are what I call a range of third-rail issues that are very difficult for politicians to deal with. Do people know what third rail refers to? Third rail comes from the expression from the New York City subway system, where you have two rails carry the train. The third rail is high voltage. If you touch it, you're dead. It's political suicide if you embrace these issues. The war on drugs is one such issue. In fact, I would say it's the classic third rail political issue that politicians want to avoid if they can. The other is like gay marriage, flag burning amendments in the Constitution. Right, every 4 years, for some reason, the Republicans bring up flag burning. We have to protect the flag. When's the last time someone burned the flag in the United States that you can recall? But it always comes up, right? And so if you dare vote against this constitutional amendment they want to propose, you're anti-flag. The war on terror, war and peace issues are generally third rail political issues. Abortion is a classic third rail issue as well. And so the Prime Minister of Luxembourg said, you know, we all know what needs to be done. We just don't know how to get reelected once we've done it. Right? That's the problem. Members of Congress are afraid to expose themselves to an easy, cheap shot from their political challengers, and they might lose. There's very little evidence to suggest that a drug war smear is enough to cost a member of Congress their seat. However, when you think about all the other scandals they may have, some of which are public, some of which are not yet known, they think, well, you know, that tax problem I had and the thing with the intern, and do I really need this a drug liability on my to go campaign with? I better leave it alone. Well, there's a way to deal with this problem, and that comes from the third quote I want to give you from Oscar Wilde. He said, if you give a man a mask, he'll tell you the truth. Right, and just yesterday I saw another quote. Google Quotes, by the way, is wonderful. It's a little widget you can customize your Google homepage with, and every day they give you 4 different quotes. And one of the quotes was, I can't remember the name of the person who said it, but said there are only 2 ways to tell the complete truth. One is anonymously, and the other is posthumously. And posthumously, for elected officials, means they're no longer running for office. Right, there's either they're a lame duck or they're out of office. Suddenly, they are very, very honest about these controversial issues. And I've had so many conversations over the past decade with members of Congress of both parties, including Republican senators, and their staffs, and they'll tell you what the drug war has not worked, is not working, will not work in the future, but they don't want to deal with this issue. They don't want to be the one that grabs the third rail. But they'll ask me, what do you think about decriminalization, regulation, legalization, taxing the trade, other alternatives? And they do this in whispered tones, as though they think they're the only ones. And this happens over and over and over, not just on Capitol Hill. This happens at meetings with, go to police chiefs meetings, for instance, and they'll take you aside and privately, one by one, they'll tell you about these, their frustrations and how they think this will never work. The military is another great example. It's shocking, but I think they're in the majority now. But they're isolated. They're afraid to come out of the closet, and they don't realize how big their numbers are. And so here's the solution. And again, it's very counterintuitive, but it's incredibly simple, which is that you will get more reasonable policies, more effective policies from Congress if you have less accountability, temporarily. Now, before you think I'm crazy, less accountability in Congress? Well, don't we have enough, irresponsible members of Congress? What I mean by that is that if you can give them a temporary veil of anonymity through a non-binding straw poll that's anonymous, right? So for 5 minutes or 15 minutes or however long this exercise takes, no one will know which way you voted. And it's non-binding because the Constitution says that 1/5 of the quorum can request a binding, a recorded vote with names. But for this little procedural exercise, your party leadership will not know how you voted. Your constituents will not know. Your political donors will not know. No one will know. And for that brief moment, you can actually vote your conscience, what you truly believe. Is this really in the best interests for the United States today, for your children, your grandchildren, your great-great-great-grandchildren yet unborn? Who speaks up for their interests? Do we have any kind of mechanisms that allow for that? We don't. It's all short-term. President Obama is the first person in my life that's actually had the guts to think in a more visionary way, that it's going to transcend generations. But apart from him, everyone knows exactly what's in his or her short-term interest on Capitol Hill or in Washington in general. Right? It's about next vote, next election cycle, raising money, that sort of thing. So if you have this non-binding straw poll, it might turn out that 3/4 or 2/3 of Congress thinks Plan Colombia, spraying chemicals to destroy the environment in Colombia to try to eradicate drugs, is a foolish thing. We've been doing this for 6 years now, 7 years for the cost of about $6 billion. There's more coca being grown in Colombia today than when we first began spraying. All right? Think of it this way. It's a great price support for coca farmers. We can't possibly destroy all the coca bushes in Colombia. Colombia is the size of Texas and California combined. The same is true of Bolivia. The same is true of Peru. These are the 3 major coca-producing countries. So we can only spray little sections of it at a time. But what that does is take enough coca bushes offline at the regional level to elevate the price of the coca leaf as a whole. Right? So imagine if people in this country really loved asparagus for some reason. People were just obsessed with asparagus. It was the new health food, cures cancer, but Congress said, no, it's illegal. We're going to pass a law outlawing asparagus. What would happen then to the price of asparagus? What would happen? What would farmers plant next year if they could, if they can get away with it? Asparagus. That's kind of what we've been doing with coca. We've been keeping the prices elevated through this unintended price support. But again, if you had a result that said 2/3 or 3/4 or the majority of Congress thought this was a foolish idea, then that would give them the political capital to come back in the recorded vote to say, look, I'm not, I'm being courageous here. I'm just voting my conscience, and it's the way that all of my colleagues of both parties obviously feel, and it turns the table on this game, because then the person who votes in favor of these policies is going to be under scrutiny. Because people are going to think, and the public might think, well, are you just one of those opportunists who are telling me what I want to hear, what you think I want to hear? Or are you really standing up for your convictions? At that point, they had better have a very good reason, a very good rationale why these stupid policies must continue. So it's a way of turning the table on the political process. And I'll leave you with this. In terms of the legacy of the war on drugs domestically. And I think it's one that, it's one of the reasons I continue to work on this issue, is that the worst casualty of the war on drugs is the concept of equal justice under law. The United States has today 2.3 million people behind bars. Does anyone know how many prisoners there are on planet Earth altogether? About 9 million. The United States has less than 5% of the planet's population. We have more than 25% of the planet's prisoners. We operate the largest penal system on planet Earth. We incarcerate more people, both in absolute numbers and per capita numbers, than any other country on Earth. This has been a result of the drug war. In 1980, for instance, the federal drug war budget was less than $1 billion. Today it is closer to $23 billion if you count all the different parts of it at the federal level. If you count the state and local spending, we're talking maybe $50 to $60 billion a year we're throwing at this problem. Of those 2.3 million people behind bars, about 1/4 of them, almost 500,000 of them, are there for non-violent drug offenses. It doesn't mean they're all nice people. Some of them are low-level offenders, some of them are traffickers, but there's no violence, no other charges involved except drugs. Right. That 500,000 people is approximately, that's more people than the entire European Union incarcerates for all offenses combined. And the EU has 100 million more citizens than we do. That 500,000 nonviolent drug war prisoners is more people than we had in our entire prison system in 1980. To paraphrase Ronald Reagan, do you feel any safer today than you did in 1980? Oh, sorry. Were any of you alive in 1980? I keep forgetting. Gotta stop doing that. But and if you go into the prisons, this is where it becomes very, very, very stark and very clear. African Americans, 12 to 13% of the population, 35% of those arrested for drug offenses in the United States, 45% of those in federal prison, and 60% in state prisons. At every step of the game, whether it's police profiling, policing, arrests, convictions, incarcerations, every step of the way. People of color, particularly black people and brown people, are disproportionately affected by the war on drugs, even though majority of crack users in this country are white. You would never know that from looking at the media. And so whether you're talking about this domestically or internationally, to me, these are issues ultimately rooted in problems of poverty, despair, and alienation. Poverty is the one everyone points to because it's the easiest one to see, but this problem cuts across class lines in very profound ways. That is to say that despair and alienation. I'm not suggesting that the reason people do drugs is because they're poor or they're trafficking in drugs because they're poor. It cuts across class lines. Plenty of white people do drugs for very different reasons as well. But ultimately, we've built a profoundly unhealthy society. At the production side as well, we're dealing with peasant farmers who've been historically abandoned by the state, marginalized by their governments, and who are also in those situations of poverty, despair, and alienation. And the drug economy offers some people a way out, or at least a temporary way out, a way of surviving. And so ultimately what I'd like to do is find a sustainable solution that actually maximizes public health and public safety and provides economic alternatives to the prohibition drug economy. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. So that's a great question. I'm going to rephrase it for the microphone. What are the better, more viable solutions on the demand side? How do you reduce the demand? There is no substitute ultimately for building a healthy society. That is to say that it's not a question of which countries have tougher drug laws that produce lower rates of drug use. In many Western European countries, for instance, they have very liberal drug laws. Our drug warriors love to make fun of the Dutch. Has anyone ever been to Amsterdam? Have you ever seen the coffee shops they have? Where the Dutch used to be a tough drug war country, and they realized it didn't work. And they thought, well, how can we minimize the harms associated with these drugs, as well as minimize the harms caused by the war on drugs? They were one of the early adopters of a philosophy that I support called harm reduction, which is to say that you can't make these things disappear. We've always had mind-altering substances throughout the history of humanity. Since the moment people learned to domesticate grains, fermentation came right afterwards. Every society has found a way to alter its consciousness. But there are ways in which we can lower the amount of drug use, as well as lower the collateral damage caused by drug use in terms of HIV, hepatitis, and all these other things. And the Dutch, being very pragmatic people, which you have to be if you live below sea level, you have to cooperate and work together, decided that they would, first of all, separate the soft drugs from the hard drugs. Because right now, in this country, the dealer who sells you marijuana may as well sell you something addictive, right? Methamphetamines, heroin, to get a repeat customer. Their interest is to maximize the profit. What the Dutch have done is separate that. So if you are over 18, you can go into a coffee shop and buy a small amount for personal consumption of marijuana or hashish. What that did was separate the dealers from the base of the consumers. But something remarkable happened. The Dutch managed to make marijuana boring. It's not forbidden fruit. So Dutch people, many of them have tried it, many have not. But they can take it or leave it, and they by and large choose to leave it. If you walk into these coffee shops, you'll find a lot of American tourists, a lot of other European tourists, but not a lot of Dutch people. So the Dutch have lower rates of marijuana use across the board compared to the U.S., including marijuana use amongst teenagers. So it's not a question of who has tougher laws that produce lower rates of use. The Dutch are also, being very pragmatic, have built a very strong and successful social safety net, as have many of the social democracies in Europe. So that the things that obsess people in this country, my parents' generation, what happens when I get old? Who's going to take care of me? Can I send the kids through college? What happens if there's a recession? What if we get sick? Will we go bankrupt? All these things that filled the heads of my parents are taken off the shoulders of people in these social democratic countries. That your basic needs, your housing, your education, your health care are either paid for by the state or subsidized. And they pay a lot more taxes, but they wouldn't trade their system for ours in a heartbeat. Not my friends in Europe anyway. And as a result, they're able to have much more liberal drug laws. When I first started working in drug policy at the demand side, I worked in East Baltimore. This 10 years ago. Mayor Schmoke, who teaches at the law school now, can tell you a lot about what was going on there at that time. And that was some of the most devastated urban landscape I'd seen in this country at that time. I would come across addicts who were so drugged out they couldn't stand up. They couldn't tell you what day of the week it was or who the president was. Although a lot of people at that time were confused who the real president should have been, but that's another matter. But these are people for whom tomorrow is not going to be a better day, right? They genuinely believe that their best days are behind them. They're products of failed educational systems, literally crumbling schools, don't have access to jobs or job training programs or transportation to the jobs that do exist in the suburbs. But our response as a society as a whole, not Kurt Schmoke, but our society as a whole, has been to say to these people, you need to be sober and have no job and no hope and no future and no opportunity. That's not an acceptable substitute for a drug control policy. There's a quote I like to give by Robert F. Kennedy, and this was from 1965. He was testifying in the Senate, and he went up to Harlem to look at the narcotics problem. This is before the drug war really took off under Nixon. 1965. Bobby Kennedy told Congress, "Now, more than at any other time in our history, the addict is a product of a society which has moved faster and further than has allowed him to go. A society which, in its complexity and its increasing material comfort, has left him behind. In taking up the use of drugs, the addict is merely exhibiting the outermost aspects of a deep-seated alienation from the society, of a combination of personal problems having both psychological and sociological aspects. The fact that addiction is bound up with the hard core of the worst problems confronting us socially makes it difficult to talk about solving it. Because solving it really means solving poverty and broken homes, racial discrimination, inadequate education, slums and unemployment. This is 1965. He understood a lot of the parameters of the drug war. Again, not to say that this is the rich people don't use drugs as well, but he understood this in a very organic way and tried to warn us not to go down this road that we eventually went down. The year I was born was the year President Lyndon Johnson began his Great Society programs, the war on poverty. And it became quickly a guns or butter issue because he couldn't pay for that as well as pay for the guns, the Vietnam War, guns or butter. And the guns won out. And the Great Society programs, the war on poverty, never really got off the starting block. And that was the last time as a society, nationally, we came together and said, this is important. We're a wealthy country. We can address these problems. That was it. So we've had generations born into less than optimal conditions. And we're at that juncture again. And I think we finally found someone who has the potential of picking up the baton that Bobby Kennedy dropped back in the 60s. So I'm very hopeful. There's been some talk, actually, that Kathleen Kennedy Townsend may be Obama's drug czar, Bobby Kennedy's daughter. And if she follows in his footsteps in that way, then I think she has the potential of being a tremendous, or the only good drug czar we've ever had. She's had some problematic issues in the past with boot camps and stuff like that, but she's a learner and she's open to dialogue. Does that address your question? I hope. All right. Oh, also, sorry, one more thing. Demand reduction, honest education. We have a system of lies, basically, exaggerations. What's the first lesson many of your parents taught you about the fable of the boy who cried wolf? Right? Don't exaggerate. Because if you do, then when you really need to get something across, people aren't going to listen to you. Because drugs can be very dangerous, parents very often overreact. It's understandable. Teachers will also do that and exaggerate. And so under the DARE program, where Officer Friendly comes in, or Not So Friendly, comes into the classroom and says, kids, if you smoke pot, you'll be shooting heroin in 6 months. And a lot of kids, they know their older siblings haven't done that, their own cohorts haven't done that. Not to say it doesn't happen, but it's a very rare thing that when it does. And they begin to think, well, what other lies are the grown-ups telling me? And they throw the baby out with the bathwater, and they don't listen to the very important messages about much more dangerous and addictive substances. I think that it's all based on lies. We also have to be honest about why people do drugs. Under DARE, kids don't do drugs. Drugs make you feel bad. No, they make you feel good. That's why people do them. There are bad consequences to them, right? We can't have a series of lies and say, well, the way we teach kids about alcohol. Kids, don't take alcohol. Alcohol is terrible for you. You'll throw up. You'll get hangovers. You'll die in a car accident. You'll get pregnant in that order until the day you turn 21. And boy, when that clock hits midnight, woohoo! Look at the ads you see on television. Look at the Budweiser commercials. You'll go to parties. You'll look better. You'll get laid. What is it about alcohol? At the moment the clock strikes 12 at midnight of your 21st birthday, it's a wonderful thing. We have this incredibly mixed message that we're sending, and it doesn't work. And finally, one of the cheapest things we can do in demand reduction, is one of the things Newt Gingrich went after, and the Republicans went after when they first last took over Congress in the mid-90s. They went after midnight basketball and after-school programs today. I mean, this is one of the cheapest and most effective ways of drug prevention. Drugs are very much a default activity. If you don't keep kids engaged in other things, it's very easy then to do something to kill the time. And drugs are very tempting under a lot of circumstances. The question of the money involved. Drug war appropriations are addictive. They're highly addictive, and they're jobs. And those jobs now, of all the different dozens of federal agencies that are now wrapped up in the drug war, it's not just the Pentagon, the State Department, and such. NASA gets a piece of the drug war pie to put anti-drug messages on their website. Department of Interior, so many departments have vested interest in the drug war now. That when you talk about cutting these budgets, you're talking about cutting jobs. Those jobs reside in congressional districts, and members of Congress, no matter what their politics, will always fight for jobs in their district. And the drug war bureaucrats themselves, again, no bureaucrat ever rose in their ranks by making their bureaucracy smaller. They look for more budgets and more rationale to justify those budgets. And if you try to cut it, they will be there testifying in front of their drug war allies in Congress, saying that, oh my God, you're going to bring calamity on this country if you dare cut their budget, cut someone else's budget. And so that's how this drug war budget keeps going up and up and up and up. The drug war budget it's a bizarre Washington animal. That is to say that if drug use starts to go up a little bit, or drug cultivation in Colombia or Afghanistan starts to go up, they say, oh no, we have to redouble our efforts and really ramp up the budget and get serious about the drug war. If, on the other hand, the drug use rates start to decline a little bit, or drug cultivation starts to go down around the world, they say, we finally found the right formula. Now we got to ramp up the budget. I wish I had a budget that worked that way. I wish my funders would fund me. No matter what happens, I get more money next year. But the rest of us have to live in the real world. So that's a big problem. But I don't think it's the only reason this continues. There are the bureaucracies and their vested interests. But until you deal with the legislators, these are the people who appropriate the money. Only Congress has the power of the purse. And you have to deal with it at that level. And that's where it gets tricky.